Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Triangulation, episode 90, recorded February 6th, 2013. Jerry Pournelle. Triangulation is brought to you by Pond 5, the world's stock media marketplace. If you're a media maker looking for video, photos, illustrations, music, sound effects, After Effects templates, or 3D models, check out Pond 5. And for an exclusive 50 free stock media files, go to pond5.com/triangulation. Want to welcome you to Triangulation, the show where I get to interview some of the most interesting people in the business, ask them questions, and, frankly, learn an awful lot. And our guest today is somebody that I've been a fan of literally for years, ever since his column in Byte magazine, and he's certainly influenced my career. But I've read most of his novels, but he's also just a fascinating person, and I can't imagine, he's almost the prototype for what this show would be. Let's welcome Jerry Pournelle to Triangulation. Hello, Jerry. I didn't know you grew up on a farm.
Yeah, in World War II, I was basically taken out of third grade in a Catholic school and taken out to Capelville, Tennessee, where we had 2 grades to a room and 4 teachers for the whole 8th grade school system. And
wow.
Yeah.
Was that to make you safe, to keep you out of the way of the Hun?
No, not Memphis. Good heavens, no. Actually, I was more exposed to the war in the country than I would have been in the city, because a lot of the farms around the place, we didn't, but many of them did, used prisoners of war, more Italian than German, as workers on the farm.
I had no idea.
Yeah, and well, Memphis in those days was surrounded by a lot of truck gardens, vegetable gardens, what you call farmers market places now.
Victory gardens, too.
Well, yeah, but victory gardens were for home use. I'm talking about truck gardens, what we called them. They basically made stuff you could put on a truck and take into a supermarket and sell. Right. And a lot of them tended to be owned by Italians.
Sure.
And so a number of Italian prisoners of war were essentially just paroled to the local farmers. They had a curfew they were supposed to be in, but they were not, they weren't treated much like prisoners. The Italians hadn't any great enthusiasm for fighting Americans to begin with.
No, but it does kind of underscore the racism of the internment camps, because those were Japanese American citizens often who were interned because they were a threat in the West, because they were a threat. Meanwhile, actual Japanese Italian soldiers were imported in to use as farm workers.
Well, there were Japanese owners of truck gardens, too, and they continued to around Memphis. Nobody ever rounded them up, but there were never any Japanese prisoners of war. But there were plenty of Italian prisoners of war, and in fact, well, schools in those days were different. We had, in 4th grade, we had a girl who was 15 years old who was still in 4th grade.
Was that because she never learned to read? What was that?
No, she could read. She didn't understand what she was reading, but
so they
she
just
could
held her
read
back
and recite the books, if you see what I mean.
But
she didn't get promoted, and everybody knew she was, a half-wit, a village idiot.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, her father had owned her. She was the heiress to one of those truck gardens, and the Italian prisoner of war there married her. And last I heard, that was 30, 40 years, but 10 years after the war, they were quite happy together.
That's kind of a sweet story, actually.
Yeah, isn't it? It turned out extremely well for her. This guy managed to marry her, so of course he didn't have to get shipped back to Italy for war. And the family was happy to have a husband for her, and everything worked out well.
So were you a science fiction buff as a kid? Did you read pulps? Did you read Tom Swift?
Yes, starting in high school. I had to be pretty self-educated up to 8th grade because I could very quickly get through the lessons, you understand. And we had an Encyclopedia Britannica out at the farmhouse where I live. So I got to spend some time reading that. That's not always the best thing you can do, you know.
And did it fuel your imagination?
Yeah, but it also fueled my abilities. You must understand that in those days, the Encyclopedia Britannica told you how to do nearly everything.
Ah.
So we decided, my friend and I, that maybe we should make some nitroglycerin. We didn't think we needed very much. We thought maybe half a cup would do. The ingredients were easy to obtain in those days. Now, in reading the process, fortunately, the encyclopedia was very explicit. It said that the reaction tended to be violently exothermic.
Yes. In other words,
I didn't quite know what that meant, but fortunately, it explained that too. So I thought, well, it's going to get hotter than hell. We have to keep it cold. So I got a ceramic bowl and a bunch of ice and dry ice. And we floated the ceramic bowl in this wash tub full of ice and dry ice. And it told you the order in which you pour the chemicals, the acid and the glycerin and the sulfuric acid, and then nitric acid and glycerin are all to be mixed. And it told you how to do that, and it cautioned you not to be violent in mixing it. And then it worked. We made it. We made a half a cup of this evil-smelling stuff that gave you a headache just to sniff it.
Then what'd you do?
Well, we poured it into an empty whiskey bottle.
Okay.
And we floated that in a hog pond. Now, do you know what a hog pond is?
Well, I can guess. It's a small pond on the farm that the hogs would water in.
It's a pond about 50, 60 feet across and about 3 feet deep of water, and under the water is about 4 feet of exactly what you expect hogs depositing in a hog pond.
I got it. All right. So the water is really mostly to keep the methane in.
The water is to keep, yes. Well, we turned the hogs loose into a cornfield that had been already picked, so that was what you did. You just let the hogs glean what was left in there. It was good to feed the hogs. So we turned them into there to get them out of the way and took the horses down to another pasture and floated that whiskey bottle out on the pond, and we stood about 50 yards away with the .22 rifle. Decided standing might not be right to do, so we got kind of behind a hay bale and we shot it with the rifle. The result was pretty spectacular. It basically removed the contents of the hog farm, all 6 feet of it.
Holy moly.
And deposited it in a uniform distribution about 100 yards in rate. Did I mention that we were about 50 yards away? So the result was there was no hiding who had done what. And
how old were you? How old were you this time?
About 14.
And so go on.
Somewhere in there, between 12 and 14, somewhere in there.
Old enough to know better.
Old enough to have been able to do it, and as to knowing better, nothing happened.
It was just hog.
That was my plea to my parents, you will understand.
Nothing's wrong. I helped fertilize the fields.
It's better than you think. It not only distributed the stuff as fertilizer, but it put about an inch of it on the barn roof, and once the sun baked that turned out to be the best roofing tile you ever saw in your life. The only long-term consequence, other than the attitude of my parents, was that the barnyard cats wouldn't speak to me for afterwards. But
you had an experimental mind even then, obviously.
I fear I did. I've always been an operations research guy. You know what an OR man is. That's a guy who knows less and less about more and more until he knows nothing at all about everything. As opposed to specialists who know more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. So
like that hog excrement, you were shallow but widespread.
You got it. That's exactly correct. Yes, and that was basically what I did for a living in the aerospace business. Was that I did operations research. But you do understand, in those days you could make fairly complicated models, but you couldn't solve them. We didn't have Excel.
Yeah, well, yeah, computers were very primitive.
Computers, you did things on a Monroe calculator.
Really?
If you wanted to enter 200 data points to get standard deviations and everything, you did them on a Monroe calculator. There wasn't any computers. Boeing had a Univac, but it was supposedly it didn't do much, and it took forever. You had to punch everything on cards and put them in. It was easier to punch them into a Monroe calculator, actually.
Yeah.
But you couldn't invert a matrix, for instance, and since a great deal of model solving requires inverting a linear matrix, if I'd had Microsoft Excel in 1958, I'd have been the world's greatest OR man.
You would have been in trouble.
Maybe. Well, we could sure come up with models you couldn't solve. I mean, you could solve them, but you had to do it by successive approximation. You couldn't do them, generic solution to it.
You building airplanes? What were you doing?
Airplanes, tactics, requirements. In an air battle, what do you want more of? There are no prizes for second place in an air battle.
No kidding. Yeah.
But what you want is to figure out, do you want them faster, more maneuverable, a longer range, all of those, and you have to figure out, there are very complicated ways of doing that, and that's kind of what we were doing. Also, in bomber-to-air battles, do you put more money into electronic countermeasures, or do you use different tactics?
So it's really modeling in a day when you didn't have the tools to do the modeling efficiently.
We had the tools to do the models, but we didn't have the tools to solve the models.
You couldn't solve them. You could build models, you couldn't solve them.
So you worked very hard to try to find solvable models, you might say.
Right.
Where you can do successive approximations until you got a solution.
Simplify the model, simplify it until you can actually calculate it.
It happens, I was just working on something just before you called. Bill Gates, in maybe a week ago, the Wall Street Journal, it'll be on my website, I just put it up, had an essay on how to solve the world's problems, which is basically to measure them.
Right.
And what he's doing is pleading for more operations research. And what I was doing in my little disquisition on what Bill had to say was pointing out that just because you can measure something doesn't mean you want to optimize on that.
It's tempting, isn't it, though? I think that's
very tempting.
It's often, you just jump to that, especially if you're a data guy, because you got the data. The solution's in there somewhere.
Yeah, and in my little piece that's online, I give, well, again, I'm a storyteller, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me tell you a story about the early days of operations research.
I'd love to hear it.
The Battle of the North Atlantic, the submarines against the convoys. And what was at stake was the survival of Europe, of course. I mean, England would go under if those convoys didn't get through.
Yes.
So they put the smartest guys they had, and including some Americans from Princeton on it, but this was mostly English, to trying to model the Battle of the North Atlantic. And they came up with a way to sink submarines. When you first see you're flying an airplane, you're at the limit of your range. You're not going to be able to stay around long. The optimum tactic for sinking the sub is to try to keep the sub in sight for as long as you have gasoline while you vector some escorts in on the sub.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly if he hasn't seen it, you've seen him, you got a better chance of sinking that sub that way than you have any other way, right?
Yep.
Sounds reasonable, doesn't it?
Sounds great.
So they did it, and they damn near lost the war because the objective here is not to sink submarines.
What is it?
The objective is tonnage of cargo getting through, of course.
Right.
So what you do is whenever you see a sub, you attack immediately and make him
Chase
dive,
him off.
because his effectiveness submerged against a convoy ship is much lower than it is if he's on the surface. And you do the same thing with every other escort ship. Immediate attack, make him break up his attack while the cargo goes on past. And lo and behold, when somebody figured out they were sub-optimizing, they were optimizing on the wrong variable, they started winning the Battle of the Atlantic because the cargo was getting through. They didn't sink any more subs after that, or damn few. They almost sunk none of them after that for a while. But the cargo got through, which is what they really was trying to do. So the point is you got to choose the right goal.
Optimize for the right solution.
And in education, that turns out to be probably the most complicated problem of the lot.
What is the goal?
Yeah, good question, isn't it? See, Bill Gates once said, he hasn't repeated this particular piece of nonsense in some years, but at one time, Bill famously said the goal is that every American kid deserves a world-class university prep education.
Yeah, that's clearly wrong. You can't afford it.
It's not only clearly wrong, it's clearly disastrous.
Yeah.
Because how do you measure that they've done that?
Right.
Well, you can measure whether they've been exposed to that curriculum.
Well, maybe that's what he's really saying, is every kid deserves the opportunity.
Yeah, but that's disastrous, isn't it?
Well, how do you decide who gets...
All right, well, that's the question we've got. The next question, but let's first understand what the problem is.
Okay.
If I take a class that includes the little girl from my fourth grade who was 15 years old, and she's still 15 and she's in fourth grade.
Right.
If I just keep socially promoting her, so she gets on up into high school, she's at the same grade level as everybody else in her class, the same age as everybody else in her same age and grade level. And I do that with everybody. They all get exposed to the university prep education. Do you think that is going to produce anybody who is actually got a prep education, or just somebody who's been exposed to it?
Because it's a scarce resource and you're spreading it too thin.
Good teaching is a scarce resource, and you are spreading it thin. You are essentially sowing your seed in both plowed and
fallow ground
land.
Yeah.
You're treating good acreage and bad acreage the same and putting the same amount of seed on both, and that is not an optimum farm policy, is it?
But then there's also systems like the French system where you test everybody at every stage and you only allow those who test appropriately to continue on, which seems...
Or the Japanese, which is even worse.
Yeah, and that seems to stifle innovative and unusual brains.
Yes, doesn't it?
Because you don't fit the mold, so you don't get the education.
But if you start with the assumption that not everybody should have the same education, you now have a classification and assignment problem.
Right.
You have to...
But you've stated the problem accurately so you can solve it.
Yeah, well, you have an assignment problem. Do you understand the difference between classification and assignment?
No, I do not.
I got a group of 40 people here. But the military recruiting understands this very well.
Okay.
You got a group of 40 recruits.
Yep.
They're already sworn in. All right. Your job is to figure out what to do with each one. Everyone's got to be used. You can't drown any of them.
Right.
Okay. That's classification.
Okay.
The assignment problem is I got 40 recruits, pick me the 10 best and tell the other 30 to go somewhere else.
Ah.
That's much easier.
Sure.
The Army Rangers know how to do that fine.
Sure.
On what, like 3 in 100 get into the Rangers who volunteer?
Right.
Something like that.
You can do that in the Army. You can't do that in society, though, because...
Well, but you can come closer than we are doing it. Let me give you another example. Let's take Joe Chumpsley, who is a kind of kid who's every professor had them. He's a B student who works his tail off so that he can become an A student.
Yeah.
And he ends up getting essentially an A average in your undergraduate school. I had plenty of them when I was teaching. Now, what do I do with him? Well, if I recommend him for Caltech, and by some miracle he gets in, he's going to flunk out, and he's not reaching his potential or anything like it, when he would have done just fine at UCLA, say, or at USC. Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
I do. Yeah.
And now let's go to the real world. Suppose the kid is, I don't know, black Lebanese. He's such a minority that he's given extra points for anything he applies to. Do you think it does him any good for him to be put into Caltech now?
I don't know.
Are you doing him any favors?
Well, no, it's the same kid, right?
Same kid.
Yeah. No, but you've added a variable that's irrelevant.
No, I haven't added a variable that's irrelevant, because what you call irrelevant is the variable that gets him into Caltech. He wouldn't have got in there in the first place if he was just the B student working hard to be an A, because it's fairly easy to tell those if you're an admissions committee.
It all, though, relies on a measurement system or a judgment system that is flawless.
No, since there is no such thing, that's impossible.
I agree. So...
Well, let me point out that the egalitarian solution is doomed to disaster. It's likely to be disastrous on every plane.
I think you could make the case. You could make the case that affirmative action is to counter bias in the judgment system. Well, that's the point. I mean, you have an imperfect system, so you attempt to compensate for bias.
All right, but while you're doing it, if you make it worse, it's even. But leave that one out. What I'm trying to get across is that putting people in places that are over their heads.
Yeah, no, I agree.
It's not good for them.
No, I agree. There's no question about that.
For the kids you put them in with, and to make it worse, it tends to prejudice the bright kids who are doing the work.
There's no question about that.
Yeah, so you need to consider all these factors when you're coming up with an education policy. And the first rule you have to have is that every kid deserves, you might say the goal is every kid deserves the best education he's capable of absorbing.
That I would agree with.
Now that one, we at least have a possibility.
Right.
But you have none of giving every kid a world-class university prep education. Do you see what I'm getting at?
And I agree with you. The devil's in the details, though, on how you do the assignment, isn't it?
Well, and to make it worse, in the high schools, you can't give anybody a world-class university prep education if you've attempted to do something of the sort in grade school.
Right.
Because the input won't be there. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Garbage in, garbage out.
You spend so dang much time teaching the freshman class to read, you haven't time to teach them calculus.
I refer you all to Jerry's current column in Chaos Manor, Optimization, Sub-Optimization, and Staggering Toward Education Improvement.
Yeah, and we ought to change the subject, but I just happened to be what
no,
I was
it's what's on your mind. I understand. No, it's fascinating, and I agree with you. And boy, the problem is, in general, we don't have the time or space or place to have these discussions.
True. Well,
not just you and me, but just in general in society.
Or anywhere in the world, because frankly, most American TV shows would have shut both of us down very quickly halfway into this conversation.
No, I agree. I agree. And we live in a political environment that's so polarized that it descends into a shouting match before you even get to a conversation.
Well, and everybody assumes that, they assume that since John and I tend towards libertarianism, for instance, we must be crazy right-wingers.
Right.
That type of thing. Isn't true.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
Well, I am. I wrote a dissertation trying to prove there was no such thing as right and left.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you feel is that on? By the way, we should tell people jerrypournelle.com. And you know what? Let's add /Chaos Manor, because that's really where you want people to go now, right?
Yeah. Well, jerrypournelle.com will get you there. No, View from Chaos Manor, the last one, that's my current one. And I also have a pretty good mail column that goes in there too.
You can go to the mail column, and people can subscribe to this. And Jerry, you support yourself now. Well, you still get royalties from the novels,
well, I
don't
get
you?
quite a lot of royalties. Amazon pays me quite well for books that are 40 years old.
That I love. We have a few of them right here.
Isn't that wonderful?
When did you? So I know you were a professor of what? Of engineering, Jerry? Of OR? What were you?
No, I was a professor of political science, and I ran the pre-law program at Pepperdine many years ago.
Was that your second career after the OR career?
Yes. Yes, what happened was the Aerospace Corporation hired me away from Boeing to come down and be the editor of a thing called Project 75. Project 75 was General Shriver's project to try to redefine the Air Force. It was done in 1964. And he had two. He had Forecast, which was Air Systems Division, and 75, which was Missile Systems, Ballistic Systems Division. And we were charged with learning everything that was known about ballistic missile technology and projecting what would be known by 1975 so that force planners could come up with what the heck should the force look like in 1975.
A challenging
that
problem.
And I was hired to be editor of it. I wasn't a director. Mr. Dorrance was the director of the project, but I was the editor, and it was my job to interview you understand, one of the nice things, one of the qualifications that you need to be in the OR game, which I had when I was that age. I'm far too old to do this stuff now. But when I was that age, I could tool up and learn things fast.
Yeah, right. That makes sense.
So for a period there, I was the world's greatest expert on pendulous inertial guidance systems.
Pendulous inertial guidance systems.
Yeah, one 24-hour period.
That's PIGS, Jerry. The acronym is PIGS.
Yeah, PIGA, yeah. And in those days, remember, we didn't.
Wait a minute. Does this go back to the Hog Pond incident?
No, it doesn't.
Because that was a pendulous inertial guidance system as well.
But the thing was, I knew more about it than any other human being in the world.
Wow.
Because I was the only guy in the country who had the clearance to talk to everybody in it.
Cool.
And who everybody was instructed to tell me what they knew.
You know, I think it's that is a wonderful skill to be able to gather information, absorb it, distill it, and come up with a valid conclusion from it.
I used to be pretty good at it. I was so good at it that after 75, the North American, which was then a fairly major player in the Air Force's air design stuff, they had a study that was in trouble that the Air Force wanted to have it succeed. So they basically went and told North American, give this guy 50% more than he's making now so he can come over here and run this thing for you, because we're tired of you flooping around with it.
I love it. Now,
I
were you writing at this time, Jerry, or was this...
Only reports and that sort of thing. Now, I was good friends with a man named Robert Heinlein in those days. And I used to tell Robert I wrote more science fiction than he did, but I didn't have to put any characters in it.
How did you meet Robert Heinlein?
They had a World Science Fiction Convention in Seattle in 1961. And I was at Boeing then, and in the bomber weapons design unit, and I was a systems analyst with Boeing. I went to the convention with the intention of meeting Mr. Heinlein and also Poul Anderson.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
It happened. I met them both there, and we became lifelong friends.
That's marvelous. So you were a sci-fi fan.
I was very much a sci-fi fan.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I started reading science fiction, and fortunately, after I got out of the 8th grade at Capelville, they got me to the Christian Brothers High School in Memphis, and that was the smart kid school in Memphis, Tennessee. It only had classes of like 20 in the high school, and boy, did we learn. And more than that, the brothers very well understood how a smart guy like me could be so bloody lazy, because I'd never been challenged. And they had the full in locus parentis authority to beat the stuffing out of you if you didn't do. And I say, but I'm already doing the best work in the class. And Brother Fidelis would say, you may or may not be, but it isn't good enough.
Wow.
And
we're all lucky if we find somebody in our lives that can challenge us like that.
I will never forget Brother Roberts and Brother Fidelis. They're both dead now, but they are, yes, I am who and what I am because of my high school teachers more than anybody else.
Isn't that interesting? So you met Robert Heinlein, you met Poul Anderson.
And some others, but those two, Paul and I were pretty well best friends for 30 years. And I knew Robert until he died, and 2 or 3 times he'd asked me to bail out something he'd got involved in that he didn't have the management to keep going anymore, so I did. I don't mean writing. I mean, things like guest of honor appearances where he just couldn't get along with the kids that were running the convention.
Was he a prick? He struck me as a prickly kind of guy.
He was and he wasn't. He was old school. You got to remember, well, I'll give you an example. He was guest of honor at the 1976 Worldcon in Kansas City, which is very close to where he was born. And he and the committee simply didn't understand each other. Yeah. And finally one day, Jenny called me and said, Robert's thinking of not going to the convention. And I said, I gather you want me to go to talk to the kids and see if we can't straighten this out. And she said, would you? And I said, sure. So I did. And it was just a lot of things. He was a gentleman of the old school. For instance, the kids had experimented with the idea that instead of having him give a guest of honor speech, they'd have a roast.
Oh, dear. Don't do that. That sounds like a bad idea.
For somebody like me, that might be fun.
Yeah.
But for Mr. Heinlein, that was, he considered, I mean, he was going to be guest of honor and stay in the Harry Truman room in the best hotel in Kansas City. And this was kind of a boyhood dream of his, in a sense.
Sure.
And here they were going to have his friends come up and say nasty things about him.
Yeah, that's not nice.
I mean, he was horrified.
Yeah.
Well, the kids didn't understand that. So I straightened out. There were a whole match of misunderstandings like that. I got it all straightened out, and everything was fixed. And it's all done, and I told the kids, now I said, now, do you think there's a generation gap between us that I was kind of hard to get along with? And they said, oh, yeah. And I said, I want you to understand that Robert graduated from the Naval Academy before I was born.
Oh, dear. That's a double generation gap.
Yeah, exactly. So I was able to see his point of view and theirs.
Yeah,
I sat in
bridge.
between them well enough that I could do that.
Yeah.
Well, I did several things like that for him, which is why we were friends till I'm probably the last of his friends.
Wow.
I'm not sure there are very many people who ever knew him well who're still alive.
Wow.
He called me about a week before he died, and we talked for about 2 hours on the phone. He said, we opened a bottle of champagne for dinner. And said, and Jenny didn't want but a glass, and it doesn't keep. So I drank the rest of it, and I'm feeling pretty good. Said, you got time to talk? And I said, yes, sir, I got time to talk. He said, well, I've been making a list of people who'd be better dead. And I decided to call you, and you helped me make the list.
Oh, that's fun.
The first name on the list, but I ain't going to tell you who the first name on the list is. I went to a roast in that guy's honor a few years later, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't get up and tell that story. I thought that would just be too humiliating, that this chap was at the top of the list of people Robert Heinlein thought would be better dead. So
maybe yes, maybe no.
I didn't do it.
So was it Robert Heinlein who convinced you to write? Who talked you into doing that?
Actually, bad writers.
You read stuff and you said I could do better.
Yeah, I was reading Astounding became analog science fiction, and I can do better than that.
Most of that pulp stuff is not well written.
No, some of it was, and most was awful. I mean, Paul was one of the best of the analog.
Philip K. Dick wrote for pulps. A lot of guys in those days, that's kind of, most of them did write for the pulps.
A lot of good stuff in there, and there was a lot of awful stuff. Yeah. So I thought, and then I also read a lot of bad detective novels. And when I was at Pepperdine, I had a little time, and I just decided to try to write a first-person action-adventure novel called Red Heroine. It's available on Amazon. It's a period piece. It's about university student life in the 1950s mainly. And but it's also an action adventure, and I wrote it, and I thought, well, okay, Mr. Heinlein, I have been sending you analytical critiques of some of the science in your stuff for a long time. You've been drawing on me for a while. I'm going to ask you to do me the favor of reading this book. And he said, you know how big a favor you asked me? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, oh, all right.
As long as you understand, it's a big favor.
So he read it, and he sent me about a 30-page outline of what I should do to it. And I mean, it went from misspelled words to things like, there is a mild break in empathy in paragraph 3 on page 41.
Wow.
Fix it. And I did that. I did all of that. And I sent it back to him, and he said, son of a bitch, you're the first guy who ever took my advice. So he read it over, and he said, by golly, it's not bad. I'll send it to my agent.
Wow.
So he sent it to Lurton Blassingame, who at that time was the best science fiction agent in the business. And I've had the Blassingame agency ever since, so I have no agent stories to tell.
That's pretty good.
And that's what got me going, because I now had somebody who could tell me whether or not something I wrote would sell.
But you were comfortable at typewriter, as you said. You'd written books before, had you not? But about technology, about
technology. But I'd written very thick books, and of course I wrote dissertations.
Your book on, according to Wikipedia, your book on the strategy of technology has been used as a textbook at West Point, the Air Force Academy, the Air War College, and the National War College.
Yep. Strategy of technology is dated now because the examples are all Cold War, and so they're basically Russian. But the principles are the same, and as I understand it, there are a couple of senior Pentagon officials who are involved with my son, who is a Navy officer, in possibly revising it to put in examples post-Cold War that are more general examples and bringing it out again. So that'd be nice. Yeah.
So
no, I have written books before, and so.
But Red Heroine was your first fiction.
Red Heroine was the first fiction novel. I wrote some science fiction. My first science fiction, I sent a bunch of science fiction stories to John Campbell at Astounding, and he'd send them back with 4-page letters telling me why they weren't any good, but I ought to keep writing.
That's good.
It was nice of him, and one day I sent one called Peace with Honor, and I didn't get a 4-page letter. I got back a thin envelope, and I opened it up, and there was a check in it. So,
that's nice. That must have been a great moment for you.
Yeah,
or not. I mean...
No, it was. And then he bought everything I wrote for a while after that and died.
Not related.
Not related, but it happened very quickly after he began buying my stuff. He died.
Oh, dear.
And Miss Tarrant, who was the managing editor, essentially was putting the magazine together out of things that Mr. Campbell had bought. She wasn't buying new stuff. She was just making the magazine up out of stuff that Mr. Campbell had bought. And she had one issue. There was so much of mine that she got me to use a pen name on some of them. And Paul Anderson, who knew who my pen name was, looked at it and said, "You rascal, are you doing everything except taking over the editorship?" Because they had offered the editorship to Paul, but he didn't want it. And he told them they should offer it to me, and they did. And I looked at what they were paying, and I couldn't live in New York on that. So, and I knew it was a full-time job. They considered it a part-time job. So Ben Bova took it, and he did a marvelous job. So everybody was happy. In those days, analog was enormously important to science fiction writers because it was one of the main sources of income.
But I would imagine that your day job, this is probably not something you want everybody to know you're writing this stuff, or
that's why I wrote Red Heroine under a pen name. Pepperdine in those days was a Church of Christ college, and they really didn't want novels written by a faculty member in which the characters seduced each other.
Yeah. So what was your pen name?
Wade Curtis.
Wade Curtis, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking to Wade Curtis on Triangulation.
It's generally known. As I said, there was one issue of Analog in which, let's see, there was a segment of Spaceship for the King, which was a novel they were serializing. And I had a novelette, and I had a nonfiction article, because I wrote lots of nonfiction for science fiction magazines.
Really? On what topics? On military topics?
Mostly rocketry in the space program. I was a big space cadet, you know.
Yeah, you still are.
And still am.
I know you're a big supporter of private space exploration.
Private space and the whole business. Oh, yeah. I was Newt Gingrich's science advisor for 20 years.
Well, actually, and, I knew that, but I did not know that you, according to Wikipedia, got involved in politics in the 60s as working for Mayor Yorty.
Yeah, among other Democrat. See, I'm not really a crazy writer.
You were executive assistant to the mayor in charge of research for 2 weeks.
Was director of research for the city of Los Angeles.
What happened?
Mayor wanted to run for governor, and I wasn't going to write his speeches against Ronald Reagan.
Interesting.
So he said, well, in that case, you better find another job. And I said, do I get a recommendation? He said, of course. So I got a position as director of research for a small educational foundation. And then I was hired as a consultant to the regents of the University of California to help develop a master plan for the California State University system, all of which was thrown away as soon as it was implemented. But that's
well, you wouldn't want any responsibility for what it's become anyway.
Well, the original plan was that there were not going to be any California state universities. There was the University of California and California state colleges. And the California state colleges were to be teaching institutions and not have graduate schools and not give graduate degrees. And they were to take care of the undergraduates who couldn't get into the undergraduate programs at the University of California. And the University of California was going to be much higher level closer to Caltech than USC. I'll put it that way.
Right.
And it was going to be just the major campuses, which is to say Berkeley, Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, San Diego, and and Los Angeles. And that was it. That was going to be the campuses of the university system. And the state college system would handle everything else. And it was all free, of course.
Now, let's. I'm going to take a break. I do want to talk a little bit about your collaboration with Larry Niven, your later novels. And you mentioned, and I'd love to. I don't know if we have time to get into it. Maybe another day. That your PhD thesis was about left-right, the left-right model in American politics, and now that was in the '60s, yeah.
Yes.
And I wonder how much has changed.
It was filed in the 60s. I wrote most of it in about late 50s.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And I'm curious as to whether that model still holds. I know you have a kind of an axis that you've talked about since then. But anyway, we'll hold on for that for a little bit more. I wish we had about 8 hours to talk to you, Jerry, but we got another about 15 minutes, if you don't mind.
Do it another time. That's fine.
You're the greatest. I love talking to you. And, of course, Jerry is a regular on This Week in Tech. Among other things, we always like having him on with Dvorak and hearing about the good old days when computer journalism meant something.
Well, it sure did to me. They paid me $10,000 a month for those columns, and
wow,
that was not bad.
That's good money. And I have to say, the Chaos Manor column in Byte Magazine was what inspired me because, and I've said this before, it was the first technology writing I'd ever read that was written not from the point of view of the companies that you were covering, but from the point of view of the user.
Well, you understand that a lot of people couldn't figure out why in the world was I better known than anybody else in the computer business except maybe Dvorak. And they never figured out the secret.
What was it?
I wrote the Field and Stream column.
That's what it was, huh?
Pure and simple. Me and Joe went hunting. Well, me and old Zeke went computing, and that was basically all I did. We went out in this Ford truck with Peabody shotguns, and.
But that's exactly right, because you'd have a problem with all your computers had a name Zeke and whatever, and you'd have a problem with Zeke, and you'd go solve that problem. And I loved it because it was talking about the stuff that I wanted to do and was interested in a way that was very identifiable. I never thought of it as the Field and Stream column, but you're absolutely right.
Well, it was, and that was the great secret I never told anybody.
Wow. And no, you know what? I don't know who's writing the Field and Stream column these days.
Nobody really, because it's not as interesting as it used to be.
I guess not.
Or I could make it that interesting again, but
I'm
getting old and I'm slow. I mean, to do that, I had to go to all these shows and peep shows and meetings with the research staff. And I mean, I knew about Microsoft Development Network before anybody else, just about.
Right.
Well,
you were the only guy who has your stature these days probably is Walt Mossberg. And so for the people watching, this generation watching today, Jerry was Walt Mossberg times 5. I mean, he was the guy. It was you and Dvorak. You were the guys. And if you were in the tech biz and you had a company or a product, you got to get Jerry to write about it. That was the holy grail.
Yeah, it worked. It was great while it lasted.
That's too bad because we never really appreciate what we got when we got it, right? Not till afterwards.
But the need for it is not so great.
I don't know.
Nowadays, there's an awful lot of stuff out there that is good enough.
Absolutely. But I think that there's also a lot of confusion in the consumer world about what to use and do I need this thing? And it's just and everybody everybody's using it now. It's no longer a niche.
But Leo, the decisions aren't quite so critical.
No, they're not. Absolutely.
Which smartphone do you use?
An
It
Android,
doesn't
right?
matter
But it
that
doesn't matter
much.
that much. We try to make a big deal about the differences, but you're right. They're more the same than they are different.
Which tablet do you use? It
Right.
doesn't matter that much. The important thing is that they exist.
Right.
Now, back when Bill Gates got the bee in his bonnet that he was going to invent tablet computer technology, that was exciting and important. And it's interesting that Gates kind of abandoned Microsoft just about the time when his fervor for tablet computers would have driven the company in the direction it ought to have gone in. And Microsoft could have been out there with tablets a long time before anybody else did, because Bill liked them. He liked to use them, just like I did. I loved my old compact tablet. But Bill kind of got out of that business, and he and Melinda went off saving the world at about the time that, and I don't say that sarcastically, he means it. I mean,
sure
here's
does.
a guy with an awful lot of money who really wants to try to do good with it.
I agree.
And you can't, I don't see how you can detract him for that.
Absolutely.
He's also one of the brightest guys I ever met, but.
Let's get some Bill Gates stories in a bit. I'd love to do some of that.
Well, I've got a few.
I bet you do. Jerry Pournelle is our guest, science fiction author, computer columnist, raconteur, and just an all-around fascinating fellow. We'll have more with him in just a bit. Our show today brought to you by Pond 5, the world's stock media marketplace. You know, these days, if you're doing a podcast, a video, a PowerPoint presentation, you very often say, gosh, if I only could illustrate this, or if I could sweeten the sound, or if I could only add some video to this, Pond 5 is the place to go. Pond 5 is a great resource for royalty-free stock media. What does that mean? It means you pay once, and usually just a few bucks, for the motion picture, the video, the photo, the illustration, the music, and then you can use it. It's yours to use. But the best part is you can feel good about that, because the person who made that content is also getting paid the highest royalty rate in the business. They set their own prices. Media makers love Pond 5. Media users love it too. 1.4 million videos, 8.2 million photos, 750,000 illustrations, 366,000 sound effects and music bumpers, 3D models, After Effects projects, and more, all at pond5.com. Go there, get your free media file every week. They have a new media file you can download, a stock clip. This week it's winter. Let me just take a look at the winter. It's at 1080p, by the way. Almost all their video. Oh, that's pretty. By the way, they'll take the watermark out of there when you download it, of course. So imagine how you could use that in your next presentation. Heck, you could make the next Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back. It could be the ice planet. Here's the deal. I got 50 free stock media files for you right now when you visit pond5.com/triangulation. It'll give you a chance to use the browser to see how it works, to sign up for a free account, to get a sense of what Pond 5 can do for you. Absolutely free. Pond5, P-O-N-D, the number 5.com/triangulation. 50 free stock media files. Just try those. Do that for me. And then the next time you need some media for your podcast, for your video, for your presentation, just keep Pond 5 in mind, will you? Pond5.com. And if you're a media maker, check out their amazing royalty rates. They're great deals. It's really a good way to make a little money on the side. Jerry Pournelle is our guest on Triangulation. Always lots of fun. This is the point in Triangulation where I often give the chance for the chat room to ask questions. One of the questions they all wanted to know is, how did you meet Larry Niven, and how did you start collaborating with him?
It's simple. I was my only income at that time. Okay, I was one of the science mission directors for Apollo 18.
I didn't know that.
Well, you say, but there was no Apollo 18.
There was no Apollo 18. I would say that if I knew.
And I say, yes, we were planning it, and it became obvious that there would not be an Apollo 18.
Oh, how horrible.
See, having finished the job that North American hired me for at a very senior level,
right,
they didn't have much for me to do just then. And about that time, Jay Worthington, who was the director of operations research, got an appointment as a professor at the University of Santa Barbara, and he said, why don't you become director of OR? Well, that would have fit the level at which they were paying me at the time. But the problem was that I am a lousy senior manager, Leo. I mean, my management style, I sort of learned in the Army. Sergeant, take that man out and shoot him. And that probably doesn't work too well in aerospace, you see. So I looked at it and I realized that the director of operations research doesn't get to do any operations research. He spends all his time clearing the weeds away so that other people can do the work. And about that time, Pepperdine offered me a professorship to come over and be there, and I thought, yep, okay, I'll do that. So I was there, and that worked well, and then it.
Were you a good professor, Jerry?
I was a very good professor, but that's the trouble. It's hard work. It's such hard work.
Yeah, it is.
I thought I could find something else that I could do that didn't take that much of my time, because I had a new family then, and I was spending most of my life away from them, doing things because I was also director of the Pepperdine Research Institute, which really meant I ran a grant proposal mill for them because I know how to write those things.
Yeah.
And so when the University of California offered me a fairly good fee as a consultant on the master plan, I took that, but that was running low, and I thought, well, should I tell it why I stayed in writing and not going on in the civil service and space business?
Sure, and then that'll lead into Larry Niven. Yeah,
religious experience.
A religious experience.
Yeah, but before you do, I'll tell this story, but remind me when you finish that. What I really wanted to do was say something about your sponsor, who I didn't know about before, this pond farm.
Yeah,
because the whole future of fiction is liable to be involved in some of this. So I'll do that.
No kidding. Now I'm really curious. All right.
Yeah, but okay.
We need another 4-hour interview with Jerry.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
It brings me to 1972.
Okay.
And I was decided that I wasn't making a living as a freelance writer, and maybe I should get back into the operations research business. And basically, the Army offered me a GS-13 to go to St. Louis and be a senior member of the operations research team on developing the Army's aviation program, which is to say helicopters and that sort of thing.
See, you're in demand, Jerry, but I could see you want to be home,
was indeed.
too.
And to go in because I'd never been a civil servant, to go in at GS-13,
good start,
at the lateral place, requires the vote of the commission, of the Civil Service Commission itself. It is a very exceptional thing to do. And they had voted, and I had the papers on my desk. I'm ready to sign them. I was just about ready to move to St. Louis and become essentially the guy who was doing the operations research on the Army's aviation procurement program and what kind of ships to buy, when we had an earthquake. You remember the earthquake in 72?
I do.
It shook the holy hell out of the place, and when it finished, now, I mean, it was bad. The library, the Los Angeles library, had so many books falling off the shelves. They were asking for volunteers to come in and just put them on the shelf.
Stack
them. Not refile them, just get them off the floor.
Holy cow. Is that the Northridge quake? I'm trying to remember. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And that quake, in my house, I have 7,000 books, and one fell off the shelves. One. Oh, that's weird. I go over and pick it up, and it's by Robert Morris, and it's called No Wonder We Are Losing. Morris was the counsel for the Senate Investigating Committee, which is to say McCarthy's committee.
And this you took as a message.
And this book is on the floor, and it's the only book, and it's No Wonder We Are Losing, and it was basically a right-wing tract on how the communists were infiltrating the country.
Yeah.
Which the language was a little extreme, but there was nothing in it that wasn't true. It was taken out of the testimony that they got. But anyway, I looked at it and I said, well, that's maybe there's a message in there. and I put it back on the shelf, and I didn't think about it anymore.
What could the message have been?
Wait a minute. Well, yeah,
you should go out chasing commies?
Until we get to the story, you'll find out.
Right.
So the next morning, the phone rang, and it rang at about 8:30 in the morning. And my wife was substitute teaching at the time, and I don't promise to be either civil or coherent before 10 in the morning. So it got me up. And I staggered into the office and picked up the phone, and and the voice said, John Pournelle. And I thought, well, that's close enough for this time of the morning. I said, yeah. And he said, this is Robert Morris.
Wow. The guy who wrote the book.
And you got it. And I'm standing there. I can't believe this. And I said, yes, sir. He said, you know who I am? And I said, yes, I do, sir. I hadn't until
I just happened to see your book the other day.
Said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, well, I am, among other things, the publisher of a National Catholic Press publication called Twin Circle, and we want you to do an article on the earthquake. I want 700 words, and I will pay you $800.
All right.
In those days, my rent was $400. I mean, my house payment was $400.
That's a lot of money.
You're talking about 2 days' work, and that was a dang near a month's pay in those days, even for somebody making a lot of money. I mean, I was making what, $24,000 or $2,000 a month in the mayor's office. So you can see that it. Yeah, I said, sure, I can do that. So I wrote the article. And it happened that the magazine was published and edited in Los Angeles, and I went down to meet the editor, and I gave him the piece, and he looked at it, and he liked it, and he said, you got this done in a day? And I said, yeah. And he said, can you do science articles like that? Oh. Scientific, correct stuff like that in that sort of thing? 700 words. And I said, I could. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I ain't going to pay you any $400. I mean, I'll pay you $200 a week for 700 words a week. And you're the science correspondent for Miss Magazine. And not only that, I'll pay your expenses at going to things like the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting.
Very cool. What a great
said,
job.
Wow. And I looked at it, and I realized that this is a guarantee of $800 a month, and we could live on that.
And you could probably knock that thing out in about 2 hours.
About a day's work a week.
Yeah.
And it gave me time to do any other writing. So I called the Civil Service Commission and said, thank you very much, but no. And I have not had a job since. I've become a freelance writer. Now, I later on got to know Morris pretty well, and I asked him, what caused you to call me about an earthquake article? He said, well, you wrote a book with Steve Pisoni, Strategy of Technology. And I said, yeah, I certainly did. Steve and I wrote that years ago. And he said, well, I called him. You understand, Morris lived in New Jersey, and he thought San Francisco and Los Angeles were close together. So he called Pisoni to write an article about the Los Angeles earthquake. So Steve pointed out to him that Los Angeles is 500 miles away from where he was. Said, but I had this young guy down in Los Angeles who writes pretty good, and he could probably do it for you, and here's his phone number.
Wow.
So now we understand why Morris called me.
And a lucky thing that book fell off in the Sylmar earthquake. By the way, it was the Sylmar, not the Northridge. The Sylmar earthquake.
Sylmar's the one, yeah.
Because then when Robert Morris called, you didn't hang up on him.
Well, I was astounded.
That's a very odd coincidence.
That's my only religious experience in the sense that it is such an improbable event that I can't come up with any scientific explanation of how this all happened. You know, Minsky, who is a militant atheist, his wife is quite devoted Jewish, but that's which makes for interesting family life. But Marvin and I have argued this a lot. But I said, all right, calculate probabilities. What's the probability that one book out of 7,000 is going to be the one that falls on the floor, and he's going to call me the next day? And Marvin gave up. He hasn't.
Well, it's improbable, but just because something's improbable doesn't mean it won't happen.
Well, but this is improbable in the sense of age of the universe improbable.
Yeah, it's pretty improbable. I'll grant you that.
But I wanted to say about your
Pond 5
presentation archives, I think that the nature of publishing is going to go towards, obviously towards ebooks because they're already outselling paperbacks, but I think towards enhanced novels.
Ah, I see where you're going now. Multimedia.
So that you have sketches of characters, you have maps, you have cutscenes, you have other stuff embedded in the book to set the mood, just like sound effects do and you may even have music in the background in a novel, that type of thing. And I think that is going to happen more and more. And a place like this is a good place for somebody to go to try to find out whether they want to experiment with doing that, how hard it is, and the rest of it.
No, I'm with you. I think something like iBooks Author, which Apple offers for free and allows you to do that kind of rich media very easily, is a real opportunity for somebody.
Yeah, Scrivener is another one that
Scrivener's good, yeah. Do you read graphic novels? Are you a fan of graphic novels?
I'm not really, although they keep trying to get me to write a story for Chrissy Claus, who is Santa Claus's granddaughter.
Chrissy Claus.
Yes, her father didn't want to go into the family business, but her grandfather wants her to come into the family business. And she's also an elf, so she has a certain amount of magic powers. And of course, she has some reindeer that are loyal to her, and she has a sled that has this magic trick of creating a chimney into any place she wants to go. And
Jerry, it's no Lucifer's hammer. I got to tell you right now.
No, but it's just fun, and they've been. I wouldn't have to draw it, and Marv Wolfman been trying to tell me how to write scenarios for comic strips. He's the guy who invented, I don't know, many of the Marvel Comics characters. The Wolverine. That's one he is.
Yeah. You have written young adult fiction. I mean, Star Swarm is for young adults, right?
I have indeed, and it's selling well.
Yeah.
And I love it. Yeah, I think it's a great book.
So you're not against the idea of writing something kids might enjoy?
No, well, nowadays, how do you tell the difference between young and adult and anything else?
You don't. And I think there's a lot of people who are writing who probably never would have written young adult who are, writing really great stuff. I mean, Hunger Games, really great stuff.
Oh, exactly. Well, a lot of my military science fiction stories, and not just military, but the ones that essentially involved younger people in adventures of one kind or another, science fiction, sold probably better in PXs than anywhere else.
Sure, of course.
And that's a young adult audience.
Yeah, it is. Come to think of it, 18.
Yeah. So I once asked Robert Heinlein what the difference between a juvenile and an adult novel was, and he said, well, in a juvenile, you can't put any sex in it because the librarians won't buy the book if you do. And
Robert loved his busty heroines.
He sure did, and he could write sex scenes, but he wasn't allowed to,
right.
And didn't, and until he, towards the end, when he got kind of self-indulgent and wrote these books that were far too long, he should have edited them down some. But he had great scenes. Every scene in them is great. They're just too many. Yeah.
It's a common problem with successful creators of all kinds.
Very successful. He could no longer be edited. Nobody dared edit him.
Exactly.
And somebody should have done him the favor of saying, Robert, Time Enough for Love has 3 great novels in it. Why don't you make it 3 great novels instead of one big mess? But
this from a guy who writes some of the longest novels I've ever read, Jerry Pournelle.
Oh, I don't.
But you have help doing that.
Lucifer's Hammer was long. I will agree. Lucifer's Hammer was so dang long, Leo, that when they were at that time, no paperback had ever sold at more than $3.95. And they didn't think they could make money on the book that big at $3.95, and they went for weeks trying to figure out, could you break it into 2 books? No, we can't. And finally, they bit the bullet and did, and put it out at $5.95, and it was 14 weeks as number 2 on the bestseller list.
Such a great book.
Yeah, it never made number 1 because that crazy Thornbirds.
Those darn Thornbirds, I tell you.
Yeah. And then that doggone woman had the nerve, after she'd kept me off being number 1 on the bestseller list, to go write one of the best Roman historical novels I've ever read.
I love that. I can't remember the name of it, but I read it too, and I thought it was wonderful.
Well, she had a whole series of them around Caesar's time, and they were terrific. They started with Marius and went on to Octavian, and they're terrific historical novels.
I love historical novels. You do too?
I do too. I do too.
So, how did you meet Larry? I got Bill Gates questions and Larry Niven questions. Then we'll call it a day. How did you meet Larry Niven?
I tracked him down.
Just like Heinlein, just like Poul Anderson.
To some extent. I mean, what happened was I decided, all right, I've got an income out of essentially 2 days of work a week, and I've got $800 a month, which is enough to pay the rent, or to pay the payments, and to keep the cars going and so forth. And so that's a good base. Now I have to be able to sell other things.
Yeah.
So one way to do that is that I called up Jim Bain, and actually, Jim wasn't Jim. It was Ayler Jacobson, was the editor of Galaxy Science Fiction. And I said, since Willy Ley died, you haven't had a science editor at Galaxy. Would you like a monthly science columnist? And he said, yeah, I guess I would. Or at least I sent him a couple of pieces, and he said, yeah, I'd like that. And he saw some of the, So
you were doing this for Twin Circles, and then you started doing it for Galaxy.
And not only that, but the research I did on the one would always make another, if you see what I mean. I could always take one of the 700-word pieces. You understand, Twin Circle was not easy. Here is this magazine that's to be sold to the general population in Catholic churches, but it is read by Jesuit professors of physics.
Oh, boy.
So you rather well have to get things right. But they also have to be understandable to the guy who bought it, because he thinks his kid might want to know what a laser is.
Right.
So that was not the easiest job as it sounds like, but it was. And then I was the science columnist for Galaxy. So being science editor of Galaxy was a fairly prestigious thing to be. After all, Willy Ley had been the starting science editor for Galaxy. So I got to thinking, now, how can I make a name in fiction? Well, the best way to make a name in fiction would be to associate with somebody who already is a big name in fiction, but who isn't reaching the potential he ought to have. And I looked at the field, at the people who were well known. It was obviously Mr. Heinlein, and he ain't gonna collaborate with me, and I wouldn't have dared ask him. There's Poul Anderson. I could have improved a lot of what Paul was doing, and I could also have improved his business management and made a lot more money for him than he was making for himself. But Paul lived in San Francisco, and this is back before internet. You understand? We didn't have any way of emailing stuff back and forth. You had to mail paper back and forth, and that wasn't going to do. And a friend of mine, Dan Alderson, said, there's Larry Niven. And I read it, and I realized, I'm right, you're right. Larry writes better than I do, but I can think up plots better than he can.
Interesting.
Between us. And so
it was a division of labor. You would think
I tracked him down, and I made him an offer he couldn't refuse, namely and to wit, that we'd work on this together. I'd do essentially most of the work, and I would be the guy who rewrote at the end so that it smoothed out the transition so you couldn't tell who wrote which scene. And you can't. By the way, if you read Lucifer's Hammer, you can't figure out who wrote which scene.
No, in fact, it always amazes me, because I know these are in collaborative novels, and yet it seems as if from one mind, one voice.
Well, they were successful collaborations. We have made more on this collaboration than Ellery Queen did, or who was 2 people, or Nordhoff and Hall with Mutiny on the Bounty. Lucifer's Hammer and Molten God's Eye are 2 extremely successful books.
No kidding. Really great.
Molten God's Eye has sold more copies than Sagan's Contact, as an example.
Can you read those novels today and remember, oh, yeah, I did that, Larry did that?
Yeah, no, not really anymore. There are a few scenes each of us is proud of.
Right.
But in many cases I read and I can't tell which one of us thought of that line. I don't.
And are you guys still working on novels together?
I do. The only reason I am not doing Lucifer's Anvil, which is the working title of the next book we're doing, is because I'm talking to you.
Oh, well, let's get this over with.
I did well, it's a little late now, but I did 1,000 words on it each day for the last 2 days.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Back at it, so.
Is that your typical habit? You get up at 11 and you write 1,000 words? Is that kind of what you try to do?
1,000 words is 4 pages.
Mm-hmm.
4 pages a day is a book in a year.
That seems doable, too. 1,000 words isn't a whole lot.
Isn't that much, but they need to be the right 1,000 words.
There's the trick.
You understand, a new 1,000 words, in addition to going back and rewriting the old stuff.
Yeah.
Have you read A Movable Feast by Hemingway?
One of the great novels of English literature.
Not a novel. It's
true story. All right, it's about Paris.
Autobiographical.
Paris. Yeah.
Well, in it, Hemingway tells how he always started. He wrote mostly short stories, of course, but he always started at the beginning each day and read through to the end, and he did rewriting as he went along.
Interesting.
And he did them in these big notebooks, like this thing, you know. And so that by the time he finished the early parts of his stories, it'd be rewritten 50 times, maybe.
And they'd be kind of polished. And
everything was polished perfectly. Well, with little computers, it's a lot easier.
Oh,
Back in the days when you had to do it with a fountain pen and a notebook like that, it was. But nowadays, you read, it's just automatic. When Larry and I first started, we used a Selectric typewriter. We made enough money at it that I was able to pay $12,000 for my first small computer, old Ezekiel, who used to be on display in the Smithsonian and may yet be back again.
Zeke was a S100 bus CPM system.
It was an S100 bus Z80.
Z80.
Yes. It was, and Bill Godbout's.
That's right.
Essentially.
That's right.
And Electric Pencil was our first editor.
Wow.
And you had to hit line feed at the end of every line when you did it with pencil. Carriage return just went back to the beginning of the line. It was like home. You had to do a line feed at the end of each line. But it was so much easier. But even so, when we went from typewriters, Larry saw how much easier it was for me to write these things on the little computer and then have the Diablo print them out, that he said he wanted one. So we got the guy who built mine to build him 2. That way his wife had one, he had one, and if either failed, he had a spare.
Wow. And you'd use...
remember, Niven's a Doheny.
A what?
Larry doesn't need any money from writing. Larry chose the right great-grandparents.
A Doheny.
Doheny. Old man Doheny, I drink your milkshake. I drink it up.
Oh, he had oil money.
That Doheny.
Ah.
So Larry didn't need... Larry immediately said, yeah, this is the right thing to do. So he had a duplicate of mine, 2 of them built for him. He didn't get but one printer. He got one by Diablo. Half of this $12,000 was $6,000 for a Diablo printer in those days. My wife thought I was crazy, but productivity just went sky high. Was able to do all that work, and we first started. We would print these things out and edit by hand, and then type the editing corrections into the program, you understand, into the electronic text. But after a while, we got used to on-screen editing, and by now it's just automatic. You go through and you see a word that there ought to be a better word there. It's very easy to go through and do it. It's also very easy to overwrite and end up making it worse.
Bill Gates stories. What's your favorite?
I guess my favorite Bill Gates story is the night that Paul Mace and Bill Gates looked like one was going to throw the other off the Desert Inn tower.
This must have been a Comdex.
This was a Comdex, and in those days, the best party at Comdex was the so-called either Pournelle-Dvorak or Dvorak-Pournelle party, depending on which one of us tells the story.
And you could never figure out where it was. I always wanted to go, but you had to know.
You had to. We would never tell anybody where it was, except maybe our editors, one or two people. But that was the gimmick. If you could find it, you were invited, right?
Right.
And I remember one night at the desert, and you understand this was paid for by Will Hearst.
Right.
He was paying for the whole thing.
William Randolph Hearst III, the grandson,
yes. And Will was paying for these parties, largely because he liked to have big parties, and he figured John and I would attract more people to this thing than he would, which was true.
And Will was quite the geek. Will, at the time, editor of the San Francisco Examiner. He loved technology.
Still is, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen him in maybe 5 years, but yeah. So anyway, one night, Paul Mace, who was a software writer from Oregon and mostly a guy involved in the geek community, and Bill Gates showed up at our party, and they got into an argument that ended up with literally my wife getting in between them to make sure they didn't actually strike each other. They were really unhappy. And
what were they fighting about? Do you know?
Trivia.
Of course, as always.
It was supposedly a philosophical thing. Bill's a money-grubbing capitalist, and Mace was a guy who just wanted to support himself so he could do better for the community and everything. And I don't mean that he was a socialist exactly, but Paul thought Bill was too stingy, and Bill thought Mace was a dreamer who was going to go broke. Well, it certainly turned out that Gates was right.
What was Mace's... I'm trying to remember what Mace's product was.
Oh, there were lots of utilities.
The Mace utilities, yeah.
Yes, Mace utility, a bunch of things like that. And he basically did shareware. That was his model of distribution, was shareware, and Gates obviously was not. Now, in those days, you understand, Gates was the only guy in the world, except maybe me and Dvorak, who kind of believed what he was saying, who actually believed that there would come a time when there would be a computer in every house.
Yeah.
And in every office.
That was Microsoft's motto.
Classroom. It was Bill Gates's personal goal.
Yeah.
Was a computer and everybody thought he was crazy, I didn't. I dimly understood that Moore's Law would take us there.
They often leave out, by the way, the last clause of that. A computer in every house, every school, every home, running Microsoft software.
That's been added later.
Oh, you don't think that was the goal?
No. Let's say that he had no objection to that.
Yeah. But he believed in the power of computing to change the world.
Let's be clear. Bill thought the only way you would reach that goal was to have somebody who wanted to be rich enough to make it happen.
Right. Not in a charitable sense.
By the time I'm talking about in Comdex in the late 70s, Gates was rich enough to have retired forever had he wanted to.
Sure.
He didn't have to. I used to win bets from people in bars, saying that I bet I could get Bill Gates on the telephone on a Friday night.
Yeah.
At like midnight. This is well before Bill married. And everybody said, "You're crazy." And I said, "All right, $20. Yeah, $20. So I would dial the Microsoft General switchboard and hand the guy the phone, because I sure wasn't going to use my voice on that phone, because he didn't know who the hell it was. And they said, "My God, it's Bill Gates."
He answers the phone at Microsoft after hours.
After hours, he was often the only guy in the place, and he answered the blooming telephone.
Wow.
I mean, you have no idea how hard he used to work.
He earned it, is what you're saying.
Well, there's a difference between effort and work, of course. And I suppose I should say, have no idea how much effort he put into it, but yeah, I think he earned it.
Are you, Jerry?
One last difference in effort and work.
One last question: you ever going to write your memoir?
Maybe, although in a sense I'm writing it now, aren't I?
Well, I was thinking that if we did this every once in a while, This Week in Jerry Pournelle, maybe after a year or two we'd have the whole thing. No, maybe take a little longer than that. We'd have the whole story.
Don't know.
Jerry, it's always a thrill and a pleasure. A thrill because you absolutely inspired me in my career. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I hadn't read Chaos Man or all those years in Byte magazine. A pleasure because you always stimulate. You're always fascinating. You're always quite a character, and it's really a pleasure to know you and get to work with you.
Well, thank you. I'm also always stepping on other people's lines, I suspect, which is
never a problem by any means. And we're going to have you back on Twit real soon. And I'd like to do this again so we can get to some more stories because there's so many more. But I'll let you go this time. Jerry Pournelle. Right. Thanks for joining us, Jerry.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening. 1,000 words, don't forget.
Yep, 4 pages a day is a book in a year.
I love it. Take care. Jerry Pournelle. All right, Jerry, we thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Have a great evening.
Sure, I'd like to do it again. I like doing these things, and not too often because it does use up the day.
Oh, and it's exhausting, I'm sure.
My problem being 80 years old is just keeping the energy up, and this obviously uses a great deal of my creative energy and just in these talks, but that's all right. Sunday afternoon's a good time, friend, because I don't work on Sundays anyway.
Well, and we don't want to interrupt Lucifer's Anvil. We want to get that book, so.
Oh, yeah, I understand. I won't say yes if I think it's really in the way. So
I figured as much.
This morning I had a medical appointment anyway, so part of the day was shot.
You know, I didn't ask you, how's your health? Is it good?
Quite good, as you can see. I mean, for a cancer survivor, I'm really spry. I don't have any balance.
You're 80 years old, Jerry. Some things just have to go.
Well, especially if you've had 50,000 rads of
pumped into your brain.
Hard X-ray. Basically, what my treatment was sort of similar to being a mile and a half from the Hiroshima Ground Zero behind a stone wall with a hole in the wall and your head in the hole.
Oh, crap.
And that they were pretty accurate. They did that very well, but it got most of my balance.
Well, what I'm thrilled about, Jerry, is it did not get one whit of your brain and your acuity and your sense of humor and all that. So that's great.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad you think. So one reason I come on these things is so I can see whether or not I really am still functioning, and I think I am. I have trouble changing the subject.
That's all right. I change it for you. That's my job.
Oh, yeah. It just takes me a minute to focus in on a new subject.
Yeah.
I am the original absent-minded professor.
Probably were that way your whole life.
No, I'm not. No, but Niven has been. One of the things that makes me feel better is that for all of my absent-mindedness, I ain't any worse off than Niven was when I met him. So he'll tell you that, too. You know the story about the Princeton professor?
No.
It's a classic story on absent-mindedness. He's walking across the common, and he stopped by some of his students, and they talk for a while, and they finish, and he says, pardon me, gentlemen, but which direction was I going in when you stopped me? And they said, that way, sir. And he said, good, then I've had my lunch.
And as much of a joke as that is, I think it's probably very accurate.
Pretty close to
I think that's fact, more fact than fiction. All right, Jerry. Hey, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.